honored and happy to be able to welcome Abdoumaliq Simone to Irvine, where he's with us for a couple days. We had a nice dinner last night, and we have a couple days of events with him. As many of you know, he's one of the leading urban theorists of our time. He's influenced many members of our department and all over campus. And his visit is sponsored by Anthropology and by the School of Humanities. And as someone myself who's done work in Indonesia, the work that he's done on rethinking ideas of failed cities has been very awe-inspiring and influential. He's worked all over the world and held a large number of positions. He's just moved into a new apartment, I know, in Berlin, where he is a research professor at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. And so I'm going to just welcome him for coming all the way. I know what that kind of travel is like, so I'm impressed and thankful that you are here and vertical. So today's event is called Entangled Cities, Rethinking the Urban. And the way it will work is Professor will speak for 20-25 minutes. We've got some slides. He'll give a short presentation, like 20-25 minutes. And then we have three commentators, Ackbar Abbas from Comparative Literature, and he is chair of the Department of was chair of the Department of Comparative Literature and director of the Center for the Study of Globalization and Cultures at Hong Kong University before joining us here at Irvine. How many years have you been at Irvine now?
Good question.
Anyway, I know you've been here for now. But he's written on a wide range of topics. I think most of us know him and know his work, and he's now part of a working group on finance and culture capital at the New School. And he will be the first person to speak after to be a commentator. The second person to comment will be Professor Sylvia Nam from our Department of Anthropology, where she's an assistant professor, and her research focuses on ways in which the city of Phnom Penh, Cambodia, is being urbanized by interrelated processes of speculation and urban and Asian foreign investment. And she also does work in other parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia. And then our third speaker will be Scott Bollens, who is here from Planning, Policy, and Design here at UC Irvine. And Scott Bollens is professor of Planning, Policy, and Design and the Warmington Chair in Peace and International Cooperation. I won't even try and read all the stuff on his CV, but he does a lot of work on ethnicity, urban policy, and many other topics. So we have three really wonderful folks to comment. And then after that, we'll be able to open it up for some Q&A. So it's going to be a really great event, and thank you all so much for coming in week 9. I really appreciate it. So thank you, and with no further ado, Professor Simone.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks very much for the opportunity to spend these days at Irvine. I'm basically I didn't know quite what to do in this particular talk, so I had a number of different kinds of concepts I wanted to explore, and so I'll do two of them. In some point the general thrust that I want to build off from in terms of these concepts is the notion of not urban residents, not urban citizens, but urban users, and what the notion of users really implies is, and as I say here, that urban users are not coherent entities, but shifting fields of probable actions, data sets, risk calculations, credit ratings, et cetera, and that populations are less defined by stable, differentiated attributes through which relative inequities can be measured than by the nature of their convertibility and their interoperability. The capacity of a population to compose and decompose, to become different things at different times. And what the implication of that means is that in terms of discourses of rights, urban rights, citizenship rights, of trying to forge particular kinds of stabilities, that it's increasingly difficult to use that kind of language when it comes to thinking about what it means to live in the urban. And as such, residents of cities are unfolded into different spatialization or scrutiny, consumption, maneuver, and regulation that are brought forth through various forms of social media, branding, tracking systems, and networks. So when we then talk about inhabitants and the rights appropriate to them, there's a large amount of ambiguity as to who exactly we are talking about and to, and who feels affected, and what kinds of senses are at work to perceive what is equitable or what is not. It don't mean that rights are no longer important. It don't mean that issues of equity are no longer important, but that these are particular kinds of discourses that seem to be increasingly difficult to sustain because they're based on particular assumptions about who occupies and inhabits the city. And increasingly, who inhabits the city are not us as individuals. We still do it, but we live amongst things that are other than ourselves, that both also include ourselves, that we're part of very much shifting aggregates and partialities, as Deleuze says, individuated, assembled, and somehow it seems that a lot of the language that we use in order to try to get at what it is that we do in cities lacks a kind of language, and in some ways, then, that the other key concern is that in some ways it was these very instabilities, these very ambiguities, that were resources for many people who did live in cities, and particularly cities in what was formerly known as the Global South. That it was these ambiguities, it was these inabilities to pin down exactly who were the inhabitants and under what specific circumstances inhabitants lived, that was a kind of resource for those who largely auto-constructed and built their cities. But now, in some ways, that these instabilities are, in some sense, stolen from the inhabitants and becomes a kind of modality of capital rule, become resources for much more powerful economic actors. So I'm going to talk about two interrelated concepts in light of this kind of preface. One is the notion of detachment, and one is the notion of intersection. And in some ways, they're not separate kinds of concepts. They are twins, or as a friend of mine would say, anti-twin, and they have very much overlap. And they tend to run as kinds of diagrams through oftentimes very problematic discourses. That is, these are concepts that try to make their way across the minefield of very difficult kinds of political implications, because in some ways they become concepts that are very much at the heart of what we understand to be neoliberal urban ways of thinking. But in some ways, this is the ground on which we have to operate, because I don't think we have very much of a choice to find a language outside of the neoliberal one in which we can operate. Because I think somehow the old discourses of rights and citizenship, again, do not really get at who actually lives, who's actually occupying the city. So I'll tell basically two basically scenarios or aphorisms or vignettes about detachment and intersection. And the first one is particularly for Ackbar, in terms of what I have somewhat learned from having known the guy for a long time now. At the Venice Biennale of 2013, the Danish Pavilion presented a video installation of Jesper Just that portrayed three black men navigating a large ex-urban development, Tiangdong-jeng, some 200 miles from Shanghai. And this is, in some sense, part of the exhibition. This is one image from the exhibition. So Tiangdongzhen is built as an immense replica of Paris, or more precisely, an early modernist rendition of Paris. The city was initiated in the mid-2000s, but remains largely under construction. And despite the aspirations for elegance, the rapidity and cheapness of the construction process renders much of the built landscape as already ruined. Additionally, the inhabitants of the city have largely altered the supposedly Parisian characteristics of the place, removing balconies, balustrades, and reworking the surfaces of buildings in order to make them more functional and long-lasting. The black male characters assume different positions in relationship to this environment. One man is filmed walking through the expanse of the city as if carrying out some obligatory rite of passage that needs to be expeditiously experienced and then disposed of. Another, and this is not really the one I wanted to find because there's another one where there's a man outside of the building, but I couldn't find that picture. Another presses his face closely to the surface of the buildings, inserting his body into their curvatures as if awaiting the words of some oracle, some secret to be revealed. The exhibition demonstrates the simultaneously obdurate and exhausted imagery of city form, the unyielding but never kept promise of urban life. In contrast to the barriers and high costs entailed for Africans to get into urban Europe, the supposed embodiment of all kinds of well-being, the Chinese instead have mass-produced the surface representations of that well-being as a cheap knockoff. But instead of simply bemoaning the kitsch of such simulations, or the way in which simulations take on a reality more real than their reference, the provision of Paris in Tiangdongzhen offers a way of activating different networks of urban comparison and thus potential. So somewhere between the hypervigilance to the wisdom of Western urbanity and complete disattention to it, there might be a mixed bag of orientations that could inform serious experiments with the shaping of existent and emerging urban regions. First, it is increasingly possible to put up anything in the middle of nowhere. The results may not last, but the impractical is not necessarily a deterrent to ciphers of elsewhere or to a past being instantiated anywhere. China especially has the money and political muscle to cite built environments anywhere and copy them at will. While such citation is a well-worn lesson of postmodernism, what is less considered is its inverse, that what does exist does not necessarily have to function in the way that it appears, that what does that or is relegated or is conceived. This applies not only to the now famous ghost towns of contemporary China, the vast underutilized and quickly ruined development projects, but also to the seemingly haphazard provisional constructions of urban districts whose sense of temporariness or imminent ruin have been much more long-lasting. In cities across Asia and Africa, residents constructed built environments that were not meant to last, but have persisted long past their expiration date, while definitive solutions to accommodate a particular population for a long-term future dissipate years before their time. I mean, cities are replete with these massive new mega complexes which are supposed to accommodate residents for the next 50 years, and within 5 years begin to fall apart completely. What the comparison between Paris and Tiangdongzhen, mediated by the images of African men, might also yield is the sense that the original Paris was built to be messed with, defaced, and reworked in the first place. The surface of Paris was only possible as a temporary facade, something intended to deter imagination from paying attention to how Paris was actually able to propel itself, to obscure the real machinery and real inhabitants of the city, and which now lingers only as an afterthought or a circulating brand like fast food. In this way, Paris finds its real realization in Tiang Du Jen, particularly as the latter now acts as an available space of residence for both various aspirant and leftover populations. In a not dissimilar fashion, Paris itself endures in large part because so many different kinds of people from all over the world continue to pay attention to it as some kind of culmination of modernity, even if they have to engage in practices that have little to do with that modernity in order to be able to live and to work there. Perhaps the critical dimension of this comparison is neither the real nor fake Paris, or the permutations of their relationships, but the way in which Africa brings together France and China in this exhibition. Not only in the sense that destinations of sojourning and migration have shifted as Europe becomes more fortress-like, or that more Africans will operate in China as an inevitable byproduct of the enormity of China's presence in Africa, but rather that the capacity of France to remain relevant as some kind of trope of modernity, and for China to exemplify the capacity to mushroom urban landscapes anywhere, largely depend on how Africans intersect, synthesize, or dispense with these capacities. This is because modernity could only consolidate itself in the violent renunciation of African human capability, and where the financing available to develop a significant part of the infrastructure needed to accommodate a swelling African urban population is contingent upon China's ongoing need to extract raw materials from the continent. As many African cities depend upon men and women wandering through disposable, wasted, or thrown together urban landscapes far from home, what will these aggregate exposures to a wider world of disparate cities, both copying and distancing themselves from each other, mean in terms of the ongoing shaping of African cities themselves? So in terms of a future urban imaginary, Africa posits an elongated archipelago of disparate towns and cities punctuated by diverse morphological features and terrain, contested interstices, and consolidations of land for extraction or industrial agriculture, but otherwise operating in a near continuous stream of urban settlements of various densities and built environments. I mean, you track almost hundreds of different lines across the region of Africa, supposedly empty, wasted, unoccupied, rural, and you find a kind of continuous line of various degrees of urbanization in a continuous kind of line, which you can travel days through as if you're walking through or traveling through a kind of city almost without end. Now, while significant populations now residing in makeshift settlements will be pushed out as urban land prices increase, a more hopscotch, hodgepodge complexion is going to prevail as settlements swell and contract, as higher-end built developments will leapfrog over relatively unmovable shanty towns. Conurbations cross national borders. Districts of enormous population densities will be interspersed with vast carpets of less dense, quasi-rural, quasi-urban, yet heavily populated regions. This landscape will be dotted by sporadic infrastructural articulations, replete with thousands of small connectors, buildings, and projects in various stages of completion. So any particular instantiation of settlement and work is likely to be insufficient to the processes of trying to sustain an individual or household over the long run, and so the pursuit of urban livelihood will likely entail finding ways of being involved in projects elsewhere along this line of this archipelago. And already you begin to see a kind of transmission belt of people moving from one project, one experiment, one little settlement to the other along a vast line of differentially populated settlements. It will entail mixtures of employment and entrepreneurship, cultivation, theft, borrowing, joint ventures, and speculations, where diverse activities act as hedges for the other. The salient comparison then will be of a Paris as if the Haussmann project never happened, and of a Tiangdongjiang that constructed itself as a Paris intentionally offered as a design to fall apart or never be completed. For an emergent urban Africa will be a landscape of hits and misses, of jumbled up textures and invisible edges, where different technical practices involving stitch, weave, solder, joint, hinge, fold, and glue will have to be elaborated in order to make disparate projects, buildings, practices, and populations go with each other. The African who presses his face to the wall in Jesper Justice's video does so more to find ways of enjoining himself to this environment than he does to glean some secret beneath the surface. At the same time, there's a pervasive sense of detachment in Just's depictions of these African men. This is a detachment supposedly remedied through more conscientious enactments of human interdependency with complex ecologies. Revivifying the importance of attachment to place as an organic development would intensify demonstrations of responsibility to care for both the physical and social dimensions of the built environment, rendering them more sustainable and appropriate to the needs of those who inhabit it. But yet, at the same time, a certain detachment from convictions that the virtuous is restored through recognizing our proper place within complex ecologies may be the very thing that is necessary in order to fully appreciate the ways in which cities are full of so many different kinds of forces that do not necessarily rule out the ability of people to stay in place, but which require such stability to be a function of circular dispersals and returns, of constant exiting and re-entering through side doors. In other words, stability and placement is a matter of constant recalibration, of detachment, of ducking and diving and riding waves, and not insisting upon particular grounds of propriety, property, or entrenchment. And in this way, perhaps Africa offers us a kind of suggestion of a kind of practice about what it would truly mean to live in a future urban world. And then the notion of intersection. In my Jakarta neighborhood, which is called Tebet, I live near a problematic intersection. It is problematic in that it requires a continuous assessment of how much time is necessary in order to get out of the immediate surroundings into the larger city. For example, if I want to leave my house at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I really basically have to walk about 45 minutes to get to the nearest transportation, because if I get on a bus or a car, I'm going to be stuck here for the next hour and a half or more. But it's always like where you live and when you want to go somewhere, it's always about thinking about what you're going to do. You're going to walk, you're going to take a bike, you're going to take a cab, you're going to get a bus. How are you going to get out? You're really in the middle of the urban core, so you're really sort of in the middle of things, but if you want to get out, it's almost impossible to get out. Now, the surroundings of this intersection are replete with a lot of different meandering roadways that empty out onto this intersection. So it's a place of convergence for crowds of pedestrians and hawkers and for the loading and unloading of goods. It brings together two main flow-through traffic pathways. And because of these features, the intersection is subject to oscillating gaps and closures, unpredictable rhythms of congestion and circulation. And something which also continues at night as well. Now think of all the occurrences, all the activities, all the events, all the gestures that take place at any given time in a neighborhood like Tibet. Think of how we commonly explain the causes and effects of all of these occurrences. What can have an effect on something else? Much of what we think is possible in this regard has much to do with the infrastructure of how bodies and things and words are connected. What can be seen or heard? What kinds of arrangements of bodies and materials allow for things to circulate? But also think of the possibilities that anything that takes place at any given time in Tibet might have an effect on each other outside of any seemingly plausible or visible form of mediation. That is, take any place, take any neighborhood, take any district, and you think of all the stuff that goes on there, what affects each other? Of course, our notion of what affects each other depends on lines of connection, the infrastructure between us. But in some sense, whatever takes place don't really need that mediation. We need the mediation, but the impact, the affect on the affect don't necessarily need the mediation. That somehow things intersect across distance and difference, coming together in all kinds of strange constellations and circuits of causation. I mean, you don't need sort of locality, physics locality theory to have a sense of that. I mean, I used to have a partner who used to climb up a ladder on a wall of a compound every night, and she would have a conversation with someone who was literally 200 yards away in another compound, and they would every night have this conversation with each other. And I kept thinking, what are you talking about? How do you how are you having some kind of conversation with each other? The distance, the walls, the intermediation was no blockage. They enjoyed conversing with each other every night. And I still to this day don't know what they talked about. So this intersection in Tibet is not just a physical feature of the neighborhood, but it also marks the frontiers of shifting basins of consolidation. Pockets, basins, sort of attractors, sort of like pockets of things that are like glued and congealed. These basins fold in events and materials whose interactions would tend to ramify outwards, away from each other. Or on the other hand, they bring together occurrences and actors that would seem to have no basis to connect, or connect only in arbitrary and chance encounters. Different kinds of residents and economic activities that might otherwise not pay attention to each other end up dealing with each other in unanticipated durations of time. This is not only because the transportation grid lends implicit structural definition to chunks of space, but also because the intensity and range of the activities and actors and the reverberations at the intersections are selectively incorporated as the impetus and content of more or less stabilized basins of residence, commercial and social activity within given chunks of local space. I mean, within this particular kind of picture, depending on where you enter into it, it's possible to step into a particular angle of this and see people who come out into this intersection every day, unpaid, simply taking a chance that people being stuck here will generate for them some kinds of connections. From another particular angle, you can step into another basin, and over here see that some guy who comes off as some kind of a kind of patron, gathers around him a whole bunch of people looking for possible jobs, possible opportunities. Or you can step from another angle and see that there's particular trucks that every single day deliver the wrong package to the wrong address day after day after. I mean, so you have, depending on where you step into the situation, you have sort of different basins which gather up particular kinds of materials and people that otherwise wouldn't be gathered up if you didn't have the intersection. So local solidities take place not only because particular kinds of people and activities are next to each other, or because they have histories and concepts that enable them to recognize that they have something in common. These people and activities also rely upon alternating currents and patterns of different streams and networks that provide food and services, materials, repair, leisure time, and information that are gathered up in changing bundles in particular space. Every small sub-neighborhood cannot simply depend upon one particular way of doing things and getting things done, of accessing supports and services. There has to be a lot of different possible alternatives for enacting the solidity of a place if it is not simply to atrophy and fall apart. One thing that always struck me about Jakarta is the way in which people really weren't afraid of failure. I mean, we live in urban conditions now where we're terrified of messing up. That is, if we mess up, we think it's, in some sense, the game is all over. There's no chance to recuperate. What's striking about, in some sense, popular lower working class areas of this city is that if one way doesn't work, there seems to be always the possibility of alternative ways to, because in some ways people see these things. The intersection is about the intersection of various ways of doing things. The intersection is the possibility of folding in different kinds of actors, different kinds of speech, different kinds of materials, so that, yes, even though you stabilize one particular way of doing something, there's always the possibility of engaging and folding something else. So in some ways, the entirety of the city is enacted at the intersection in various durations and manifestations, and congestion is not just a matter of too much traffic. Congestion is also an indication of the plurality of linkages at work, and from which residents selectively pay attention to or withdraw. It is evidence of all the places people are going, as the area around the destination is both a point of arrival and departure. These arrivals and departures, of course, are coded and full with different kinds of intensities of aspiration, of fatigue, and the weight of influences of all kinds. The surroundings of this intersection in Tibet are particularly heterogeneous because they contain facilities for servicing the needs and aspirations of the very different kinds of residents who live in the area. These needs and aspirations are in turn really inbuilt into space through particular forms of building and property and consumption and exposure and design. The availability of these surroundings to particular people and uses ensue from very different histories of land consolidation and tenure, zoning, resettlement, and legal frameworks. I mean, the very interesting thing about Jakarta is that there is no such thing as urban land. There's no, 1% of Jakarta is freeheld land. Of course, land is bought and sold, and of course, land is manipulated all the time. And of course, land maximizes in terms of values. But constitutionally, you still do not have urban land in Jakarta. And in some ways, that ambiguity of the status of land is important in terms of being able to support a heterogeneity of residents and practices on it. Now, of course, in some sense, there's rezoning, there's legal frameworks which are tied to documents and policies and political mechanisms and institutions and pricing and compositions of capital. The plurality of objects that have to be affiliated in working relationships which follow from these histories produce seemingly untenable densities when coupled with the sheer number of cars, trucks, and motorbikes on road layouts not easily rearranged without substantially disrupting hard-won yet constantly renegotiated balances among intensely discrepant uses and users of the area. The pathways have to follow the documents and the sentiments, as pathways also structure these documents and sentiments at the same time. So in some ways, part of the infrastructure is not just about roads and not just about highways and water and electricity, but it's like, what kind of paper do you have in your pocket? What kind of licenses do you have? What kinds of permissions do you have from, and you have to carry these, and these are routes, these are pathways that one follows in terms of navigating your way in and out of particular kinds of spaces. But it's also conceivable that the congestion at the intersection could be replaced with a different kind of congestion. That is, lateral interchanges that could enable those who reside in this area to work and live with each other in radically different formats could be actionable through a comprehensive detachment of a greater number of residents from their involvement in other parts of the city. That is, in some ways, the obvious solution to all of this all this traffic, all this congestion is, why couldn't people stay put? Why couldn't people have relationships with each other which would provide almost everything for themselves right there? After all, these are heterogeneous neighborhoods. Don't they have the kind of capacity to work, to make money, to organize, to feed, without, in a sense, having to go anywhere? And of course, this would require a realignment of resource allocation. It would require a self-constituted web of affordances that maximize mutual care and synergies of skill and income. In other words, there exists the virtual potential for an intensification of residents working, socializing, administering, producing, and distributing within the immediate surrounding themselves. It is possible that anything that takes place in Tibet could, and perhaps already is, registering an important impact on everything else outside of the visible infrastructures of cause and effect. Then why not actively use this as a way of making a different kind of everyday life for those who at least reside in Tibet? Of course, this is unlikely to happen, given the inclinations of people to put distance between themselves and others, and as part of the entropic trajectories entailed in the amassing of effort and activity. But this plane of virtual consolidation, this virtual possibility, that the intersection not only represents, not only indicates, not only embodies a kind of traffic of people trying to get out and to come back. It doesn't just simply represent a diverse population that's going to different places at work, having different positionalities in the city. It doesn't simply represent all the different ways in which inputs are coming in, but it also represents in some ways the local, the resourcefulness of the here and now and the right then as a kind of virtual consolidation that never ceases to exist as a substrate along which an actual repertoire of actual linkages, implicit and explicit, do take place to various degrees and various forms within the different neighborhoods that mark and are marked by this intersection. So what gets connected or remains apart then is a matter largely of ethical decisions, of the dynamics entailed in making the choice to actualize something that exists all along, even though that which has existed all along may not be available to human cognition or to exist in forms of calculation and verification. So what seems to be the critical key to a place like Tibet and the congestion of this intersection is this kind of very doubleness, that somehow that when we look at congestion like this, we think, all right, This is indicative of somehow people trying to reach something larger than themselves. Somehow that in some way that this is indicative of a kind of urban reality in which the linkages are outward and the inputs come from outward. But at the same time, the congestion also begins to represent really in some ways the density of materials and relationships that are already existent. And it's this already existent which in many cities of the world is in some sense being disentangled. And disentangled in the sense that then what only you have is traffic, and only you have the congestion of automobiles and vehicles that attempt to always in some way in the process of going somewhere else. Whereas what I'm trying to demonstrate with this notion of intersection is that the process of always going somewhere else also indicates that everything else, that there's also everything also right there as well. That's it. Thank you very much.
Well, it seems to me that one way to engage Malik in conversation is by riffing off some of his ideas on cities. A conversation, of course, is not an interrogation where questions find answers. Rather, it's a way to create the commons. The commons not as a kind of chimerical common ground among interlocutors, because as we know, married couples with a lot in common don't have conversations the way we want to have one. But as a space, but the commons as a kind of space of desultory movements where the unexpected happens and the event takes place. So to begin then, I would say that one remarkable aspect, it seemed to me, of Malik's work is the way he describes cities. The descriptions are detailed and meticulous, but at some point or other, and we saw a little bit of that already just now, at some point or other, the more precise the description, the more elusive and ghostly the city becomes. I mean, his descriptions of Tibet and intersections and so on and so forth. This mating of the actual and the spectral is what I think of as the Simone effect, which we get quite a lot of. And reading Malik is sometimes not unlike reading a Robbe-Grillet novel. It is as if to describe cities, we must also describe them. In other words, to restore their errancy to them, to come up with a kind of different language, to basically even invent a language. Now, take, I think, his latest book, which is Jakarta, Drawing the City Near. That's the latest book, right? Which has many, of course, many descriptive sections, but near in the title, Drawing the City Near, suggests not just proximity, but also, it seems to me, the approximate. Right? So the near, as it were, as akin to the nearly. Right? The near as not the exact, but as the nearly. For example, instead of a clear-cut description like the global south, he wants to introduce another notion, which is a kind of approximate description, which is the near south. Right? Instead of the global south, you have the near south. So, description, I think, would be one interesting part of the stuff. Now, so in other words, not the near and clear, but the near and approximate. And the approximate leads to, it seems to me, to another point, which is that the many references, it leads to the many references in Malik's writing to the deception and duplicity of the city. Something, of course, made familiar to us in film noir. But the difference is that in Malik, the difference from film noir and Malik is that in Malik, duplicity is less a moral category than it is a spatial concept. Duplicity literally means, of course, twofold, right? And the duplicitous city, therefore, is a space of folds and overlappings, or in his terms of problematic intersections. I mean, an intersection is exactly that. It's exactly a duplicitous site of overlappings. So therefore, what you see nowadays was always a city is made up of a montage, a kind of montage of cities, made up of frameworks, one superimposed, as it were, on another. So what is normal, therefore, in one framework may seem bizarre in another framework. But exactly because of the overlap, normal and bizarre cannot be pulled apart. The exemplary and the anomalous are not opposed, and hence nothing is true now except the exaggerations. And this duplicity, in the sense of a spatial notion, seems to characterize all major African and Asian cities today. Now, Malik calls the city Jakarta. That's I think his recent word for the city, which is Jakarta. I can call the exact same city Hong Kong, or Beijing, or Chongqing, and Chai Ming Lang, the filmmaker, can call also the same city Taipei. In the film, like, for example, What Time Is It Over There? Now, this evocation of the folded, entangled city brings up, I think, Malik's most, it seems to me, certainly one of his most important interventions in urban theory. His argument that it is important not to see entangled cities simply as rogue cities or failed cities, and therefore to see them that way is then to try from a variety of mixed motives to try and fix them. Try to fix them by making them, for example, more efficient, more modern, more respectful of other people's rights, even more sustainable. And I think the interesting argument, which I think we have to try and understand, is that it's not so much a matter of fixing the city, but of finding ways of turning the apparent problems and drawbacks of the city into a kind of resource. Like, for example, when he was talking about fix in China, and if you think about Paris, you might say a fake, that image you get here is a fake Paris, that this is not Paris that you're seeing in the image. But then, of course, the point is that Paris today is also not Paris, right? Paris too is not Paris. The fake is not just something that's in the fake alone, which is why it's such an interesting phenomenon to investigate. So therefore, using these problems and drawbacks and turning them into resources. Cities, we might say, have no teleology. The problem is not to make them better, but to make them work on their own terms, to facilitate their becoming city, I think, which is one of the things that Malik was talking about. In other words, it's less a question of subjecting cities to the third degree, but of holding a conversation with them. So let me now make one final point very quickly. And a final point concerns what seems to me to be an ethical political project that underlies a lot of the work Malik does, a project that resembles Spinoza's in some respects. And that has to do with the possibility of action and intervention in the city. Now, citizens, it is often said, need to be given hope so that they can act. Right? They need hope in order to act. Now, this, of course, is a politics of hope. But how about the possibility of acting when hope seems distant and even non-existent? And the problem seems insuperable. Like in the face of, for example, complete neoliberal appropriations, where there doesn't seem to be hope for any future other than the one that's put down there. How do we act? And I think this is a crucial question, because to act under such circumstances would require a different politics. Not so much a politics of hope as what we might call a politics of disappointment. Right? And it's not disappointment in the sense of being disappointed in politics. It's not in the sense of rejecting it, but coming up with a different politics. And the word, I think, that plays such a large role, and he used it also just now, in Malik's urban and political vocabulary, is endurance. And endurance is a word that speaks to large extent to such a politics. I mean, what you need, therefore, is on the issue of attachment and detachment. You need a certain detachment from certain ideas and values which are there, in order to allow yourself the ability to act under these very difficult circumstances.
So, in reading Simone's piece, I was reminded of two stories, speaking of vignettes. The first took place many years ago in a seminar in which we read Simone's For the City Yet to Come. During discussion of this book, which examines networks of dwelling in 4 African cities, an architecture student asked with great despair, how does Simone's book help us help Africa? It's not so much that she missed the point of the book, but that her point reflected a highly normative yet pervasive reading of urban life, which she saw as incomplete as well as impaired. The other is a story in the Cambodian press from a few months ago, which featured the unveiling of a multi-billion-dollar master plan for urban transport for the city of Phnom Penh. According to the master plan's project leader, without public transportation and without infrastructure, Phnom Penh would, quote, become like Jakarta. The planner's comment alludes to 2 different issues. 1, Jakarta's notorious traffic, and 2, Jakarta as a place that Phnom Penh should not aspire to be. Spoken again in discourses common amongst planners, amongst development practitioners, as well as other technicians of the city. A city seen as incomplete, and its city space requiring rational intervention and remediation. I want to note that this is not just about discourses alone, but rather how discourses are part of the tools in which cities are understood not by what they are, but by what they should be. And I think that this is Simone's major intervention. Of course, what is left obscured or unspoken in both of these stories that I share with you today is what sort of vision of the city is being mobilized as the ideal here, and thus to ask why certain cities are held to standards that most of the world's cities are unable to meet. I start with these stories because it's Simone's work that has persistently, and I would argue powerfully, challenged the taken for grantedness of certain categories, turning ideas on their very heads. Not just the idea of infrastructure, not just the idea of congestion, but the idea of the city itself. As Simone elaborates in his piece from today, congestion is not just a matter of too much traffic, but a plurality of linkages at work. And on the idea of infrastructure, Simone has productively reframed urban infrastructure as what he calls people as infrastructure, or infrastructure that is social and collaborative. As vital as the physical infrastructure of roadways and of power grids, though social infrastructure is notably contingent as well as fragile. In contrast to the relative durability of physical infrastructure, distinct here is that social infrastructure must be constantly reproduced, and it is this constant reproduction that makes the city itself. With this in mind, I wanted to offer some of my thoughts on contributions of Simone's work in the interdisciplinary field of urban studies. One is on Simone's work in relation to certain epistemologies and ontologies of urban scholarship. Specifically for those working in that vast and indeterminate space called the Third World, or the globalizing South, the challenge is to not rely on failure, despite its seductions, as a lens onto the city. But the greater challenge, and his work provides a model, is how to illuminate what makes urban life work, or the practices that he states, quote, keep people in Jakarta going. For failure tells us so very little about the ways in which life materializes and how people make do or thrive under conditions of scarcity or under conditions of opportunity. This challenge is less about the need to rehabilitate the image of Jakarta than to undertake an analysis of what he calls the majority, who provision the conditions of life through that platform that is the city. It's in this sense that Simone reworks what is a canonical framing in urban theory of urbanism as a way of life. For Lewis Worth in the 20th century Chicago, the city, by virtue of its density, its heterogeneity, and its size, produced a distinctive mode of life, defined by superficial and transitory relationships, as well as alienation, a turning inward, if you will, to cope with being in the city. The assumption for Worth was that urban life is defined by efficiency and utility, but also that the city is an already assembled thing. In Simone's take on urbanism as a way of life, we see that the city is not a given, and its residents are not passive respondents to it. Rather, he underscores how the city itself is assembled in the face of uncertainty, through interconnections, through what he calls projects, and through social relationships that are not just superficial and transitory, but are also experimental and sometimes productive. What is distinct about a 21st century urbanism as a way of life is its capacity to provoke relations of all kinds. The second contribution of Simone's work in the field of urban theory is his ability to capture movement. I would argue that urban scholars, and I'm thinking here specifically of the work of Marxist urban geographers, have fruitfully analyzed the ways that cities are produced through circuits of capitalism, through regulation, through spatial fixes. But there is less work on those other circuits of people and of practice. And so again, he reworks, to be bold, another canonical framing in urban theory, that of spatial practices and tactics of being in the city. And of course, here I'm borrowing very liberally from the work of Michel de Soto, a theorist who also captures movement beautifully. For de Soto, walking in the city is an act of improvisation, and story is a way to make claims to place. For de Soto, being in the city as a pedestrian or as a bricoleur is comprised of individual acts of appropriation of the city. The distinction in this case is that being in the city relies on a specific division of labor, and this division is notably top-down. On the top, you have what de Soto calls strategies, or governments and institutions of power. That is, strategies that produce the city. While on the bottom, you have residents who transgress the produced city through tactics, through alternative representations. That is, again, the city already exists, and pedestrians transgress the city based on existing rules and on existing grids. Again, Simone radically reworks the figure of the subject in the city as subjects who both produce and consume the city without assuming that the city is already a predetermined site. And so I wanted to close with two questions. What we know of Jakarta is that it's a megacity of 10 million, a number that seems more immense when spoken from a place like Irvine with a population of 230,000 people. So my first question is about vectors, whether you want to call them genealogical or historical or something else, behind the density and the plurality of the city of Jakarta. If Indonesia itself is this vast amalgam of islands, languages, and ethnicities, and even religions, and Jakarta is the center of the nation, what's called a primate city in the language of Southeast Asian urban studies, what is the relationship between the heterogeneity of the nation as it plays out in the heterogeneity of the city? My second question, which is related, is this. Is what you call the possibilities of life a condition of processes that are more global? That is this about the possibility of urban life at large? Or is this the possibility of urban life particular to Jakarta as well as the other African cities you mentioned? Thank you.
Good afternoon. I come at this as an urbanist, as an urban planning scholar, and also someone that's spent some time studying polarized cities that are polarized by nationalistic conflict. So I've spent a lot of time in cities that are dichotomous, and I've thought a lot about dichotomous cities. So Malik's observations about the invisibility of cities and surfaces of cities strike a deep chord with me. I read considerable amounts of his book, City Life from Jakarta to Dakar, which I highly recommend. It says in the back that it's written for an undergraduate audience. That's what the book cover says. He lays out in very clear terms some of his key concepts. I want to talk about two key concepts. Cityness, what he calls cityness in his book, not today, I don't think he used the term today, cityness, not city, but cityness, and periphery. But first I want to talk to you a little bit, some data, some urban data. In this period of time that we're in, from 2000 to 2030, the expected increase in the amount of urban land coverage in the world is expected to be greater than the cumulative urban expansion of all human history. In this 30-year period that we're in, the coverage of urban land is going to be greater in this 30-year period than in recorded history, cumulative urban expansion in all of history. So a lot of urbanization going on. A lot of it's going to be informal, or what the UN calls slums, and they define slums, of course. Today, 1/3 of all urban dwellers in the world live in slums. 1/3. 1.4 billion people live in slums as defined by the UN. Slum population growth in least developed countries, again defined by the UN. 78% of urbanites in least developed countries live in slums. In sub-Saharan Africa, 72% of urban population is in slums. South Central Asia, 58% are in slums. Mega slums, going anywhere from 0.5 million to 4 million in size, are located outside of such cities as Mexico City, Caracas, Bogota, Lima, Lagos, Baghdad, Johannesburg, Gaza, Karachi, Cape Town, etc., etc., etc. Malik himself in his books quotes that 75% of all basic needs in the majority of African cities are met through informal means. So this is a large phenomenon. Malik mentions that what language do we have outside the neoliberal economic language to describe cities? Now that's a setup, of course. We have Marxism also, we have the language of rights, but I think Malik is creating such a language of what the city is like today in many places throughout the world. He talks not about the city in this book, but of cityness, and he talks also about the periphery as it relates to cities, and ways in which the periphery can be productively brought back in to our consideration of urban life. Now, what is cityness? Cityness are elements of city life that he described. They cannot be captured by the organizing categories of modern social science. They're local and irregular. They're not planned cities and regulation. As he says in his book, City Life, the city may be the familiar form, but it is also a ruse. Okay? Cityness is a way of existing that emphasizes the importance of difference and relations between differences. It's a way of feeling that people are operating in a larger common arena of life without specific criteria of membership and belonging needing to be precisely identified or referenced. It's a people coming together without having to be integrated. These are all his words. Okay? He talks about the notion of intersection or crossroads as a way to rethink the possibilities of urban life. And he says the right to the city may be the right to be messy and inconsistent or to look disordered. Okay? And of course, as the other commentators brought out, rather than being seen as dysfunctional, this cityness is a source of creativity and imaginative coming together of different people. Now, this harkens back in the urban field to Jane Jacobs, the great New York urbanist, who talked about the darn planners who are trying to regulate and order the city, and really the richness of the city comes from what she described as organized complexity, that you cannot build or regulate it. It's organic, and you shouldn't mess with it. It's an organic and generative quality of urbanity that is unplanned, and the best things that planners or any sort of controllers should do is really stay away from it and let it blossom. In his book, Malik talks about two surfaces of the city. Surfaces, he uses the word surfaces. One turned toward the regulatory extractive functions, The other exists as a plane upon which this cityness is practiced by its inhabitants. The two surfaces exist simultaneously as a strip of intertwined atmospheres. The first more visible and central, the second more invisible and peripheral. Now this got me thinking of the great science fantasy fiction book by China Miéville called The City and the City, where each side or surface of the city, using Malik's words, are trained not to see each other. They grow up trained to unsee the other city that exists right beside them in the same urban sphere. And of course, I then think of the UCI campus and how the surface we do not see as we sit here in our plush seats are we are trained to unsee the janitors, the gardeners, the facility personnel, the chefs and the food personnel, the trucks supplying our campus, everything that makes this place go. Yet we're trying to unsee it. And yet it's absolutely essential to the functioning of this campus. And that's very consistent with Malik's approach. That what we don't see, the invisible, the cityness that he describes is absolutely essential to the operation of in this case, the campus or the city. Okay. Cityness is the city as a thing in the making. It's things that interact in ways that exceed any attempt to regulate them. Okay, he talks about a market in Lagos, a market in Jakarta, that underlying this formal regime of authority is a complex set of more informal and qualified rules. Okay. The cityness, he says, has become and always has been largely peripheral. And here's the other theme I want to talk about, periphery, a theme that I've borrowed and used heavily from Malik, I find very valuable. The very dimension that categorizes the city is often the very thing that is left out of the larger analytical picture. It's in the periphery. Okay? Despite efforts to order the city, cityness continues to haunt the city. The virtual presence of cityness in each action that's taken, in mundane actions, in markets and so forth, is made peripheral, invisible. It's another set of conditions, another way of doing things, another reality that has always been possible and always there. But it becomes peripheral. It becomes invisible. The periphery as marginalized cityness. Yet, key to his argument, and what I find very valuable, yet the viability of urban economics and innovations needs this cityness as an essential resource. What is peripheral is essential. He similarly conceives this in his treatment of the geographic periphery of the urban region. He uses periphery many different ways, not just spatial. But in the spatial consideration, the peri-urban environment, the periphery, the peri-urban environment, is simultaneously included and excluded. The periphery depends on the largest and guidance of a center, since it is a space of insufficiency and incompletion. Yet this lack in the geographic, spatial periphery, never brings it under the full auspices of the logic and development trajectories of the center. It's a loose cannon. Thus, it embodies an instability that is always potentially destabilizing of the center. Thus, paradoxically, the periphery is in need of special attention by the center. Thus, the periphery is both then ignored and at the same time occasions excessive attention. This forces the state, or the center, to exceed its own core values in order to rein it in. This brings to mind a piece by a former member of the Israeli Defense Force, James Ron, who did a book called Frontiers and Ghettos. And in this he says, in the ghettos or the homeland areas of a state, a contested state, the dominant side will treat the subordinated side somewhat normally and kind of peacefully and humanely. But it's in the frontiers, in the outer reaches, that the dominant side will beat the crap out of the subordinated side because they can get away with it at the frontiers. Also, they need to do that in the frontiers to maintain the stability of the center. Malik talks about prolific, what he calls in-between spaces, seemingly marginal wasted spaces that become in between, always pushing, always under threat. He talks about a conference calls made between Lagos and Bangkok on battered folding chairs in the back room of some instant coffee cafe. And I relate to this totally. When I march and walk through Beirut, Lebanon, these streets and buildings of Beirut are watched. watched by many, many different layers, by Arab men loitering, drinking coffee and smoking, always sitting on plastic chairs strategically located at the places near intersections and driveways where their view is most fluid. It's monitored by taxi drivers within their curbside territories, private security personnel, each having their own zone of surveillance, and less visibly by sectarian militias and their representatives. It's a very much of an informal but strongly monitored place. I relate also to a cityness in trying to describe the cities that I'm in, a Middle Eastern city, loud and obtrusive and chaotic and raw, yet with a logic. Urban traffic, anarchy, but a rushed, anxious quality to the urban landscape. Spanish city that I've been in, loud but more sophisticated, right? Barcelona, a smoother style compared to the Middle Eastern rush. The Bosnian city, the peace of the cemetery. The post-conflict death, post-trauma exhaustion, quiet. The South African black city, rhythmic flow and musical in quality. The Northern Irish city, more orderly, angularity rather than a looser flow. So those are some of the thoughts that come to mind. In conclusion of what I would say, and it addresses Ackbar's comments, I find Malik's view is hopeful and optimistic, view of creativity of persons in urbanity or cityness. The peripheral is both invisible and essential, points out the importance of what normally is invisible. He stresses using the peripheral status as an advantage, as getting the most out of invisibility. Many of the so-called lacks become occasions for residents to assemble ways of working together in innovative ways. The big challenge is how to relate my profession of town planning with its regulatory emphasis and its top-down history to what Malik is describing. This is what has been approached and confronted in South Africa, and the city I study is Johannesburg in South Africa, where since the end of apartheid you have this strong regulatory town planning regime that now is faced with large amounts of informal black townships and what to do with this. And what we've seen in South Africa is the attempt to reconceptualize and change town planning into what is called community development planning, from top down to now bottom up. Not regulatory planners, not white regulatory planners, but more black activists that were trained and got experience in the anti-apartheid struggle, and how to relate that bottom-up knowledge of the messiness of informality, how to relate that to the bureaucracy, and how to make that linkage so that the resources of a public sector can actually be used in a more fruitful, appropriate way for the messy cityness, in this case, of the black townships. So finally, Malik's writing is fascinating, it's bewildering. He's describing bewildering urbanity, so his writing is bewildering. If you're going to describe something that's bewildering, one should have a vocabulary that's also bewildering and inspiring in the best sense of that word. He's bringing out the surfacing of the invisible, that both the periphery and that the periphery is an essential part of urbanity today and in the future cities to come. And in that way, the center and periphery and the city and cityness are indeed entangled. Thank you.